We need to talk about Michael Jackson. A few weeks ago, HBO aired the documentary Leaving Neverland, where Wade Robson and James Safechuck detailed, amongst a sweeping score and more drone shots than a daily YouTube vlog, their allegations of child sex abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson. These allegations have come up again and again for years, but this time they're starting to catch on. Now, my intent with this video is not really to take sides because I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows, we're never going to know. But with Michael Jackson's strange and difficult to understand mental state back in the national conversation, I want to highlight a few points that aren't really touched on as much as they should be. It's well known that he had an abusive father and the lack of a childhood affected him for the rest of his life.
It is known.
It is known.
That's the way his eccentrics are typically explained away, but it's so much worse than you thought. Because somewhere in that little biography, you're going to read a footnote that says he was a Jehovah's Witness. And that is a huge factor to just sort of mention offhand. It's kind of a misconception that he wasn't really a witness. The fact of the matter is that Katherine Jackson converted the family into the religion in 1963, when he was just 5 years old and 1 year before he started performing. And he remained a Jehovah's Witness until 1987. That's 24 years, nearly half of his life. And Michael and LaToya were the most active of the children in the religion. It's also a misconception that his faith was just a minor facet not worth talking about. Jehovah's Witnesses aren't just some quaint, harmless little Christian denomination. They are a high-control doomsday cult that has robbed millions of people of their lives. This is a religion that harbors and protects child sex abusers. Nobody seems to want to talk about this, and it utterly blows my mind that it's hardly mentioned among the contributing factors that shaped who he grew to be. It compounds the effect of every negative point in his childhood that you've ever heard. His youth was just the right, perfect storm to create the mysterious enigma that so many admired, but few ever understood. The Jackson children suffered abuse at the hands of their father, but Michael suffered perhaps the worst of them all. Katherine Jackson was described as upset by the abuse, but she was largely passive and wouldn't divorce her husband. In fact, she didn't divorce him until after Michael had died. While Joe Jackson never converted to become a Jehovah's Witness, this is still an area where they have their hands in. The abusive father, passive mother dynamic is so common among families in that religion that it's almost their model for a nuclear family. From Katherine's side, it wasn't just that she was a passive mother. Her religion forbade her from doing anything about the abuse. Take a look at this article from The Awake, a Jehovah's Witness magazine that the Jackson family would have read in 1972. The wife, however, must prove herself to be a woman who merits her husband's understanding and consideration. She should not be surprised if her husband does not respond in a loving way when she shows herself to be contentious, irritable, and fault-finding. As the Bible puts it, better is it to dwell in a wilderness land than with a contentious wife along with vexation. Also, a husband's interest in his wife usually diminishes if she takes little interest in his plans and activities. The disagreements between husband and wife that arise through a wife's undermining the husband's position cast doubt on whether either of them really has the welfare of the family at heart. The Bible does not encourage being permissive with children either, and more people are coming to appreciate that experts, notice the quotation marks there, were wrong in advising parents not to spank their children. There has been repeated confirmation of the truth of Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof are what give wisdom, but a boy let on the loose will be causing his mother shame. So even if Joe never converted, this was still the mindset that Katherine was being indoctrinated in and ultimately empowered him to continue being abusive. In Michael Jackson's famous interview with Oprah, he talked about his feelings of isolation and loneliness that he started feeling from the age of 8.
Well, you don't get to do things that other children get to do. You know, the simple things that they so much take for granted. Having friends and slumber parties and buddies and just hanging out. There was none of that for me. I didn't have any friends when I was little. My brothers were my friends. When I was little, it was always work, 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 from one concert to the next. If it wasn't concert, it was the recording studio. If it wasn't that, it was TV shows or interviews or picture sessions. It was always something to do.
This is another very common thing among witnesses, but a little more complex due to the circumstances of his life. His busy work schedule was probably the largest factor in his loneliness, but it's important to remember that even in moments of respite, Jehovah's Witnesses are not allowed to associate with people who are not witnesses. He can talk to them, he can conduct business, but he cannot be their friend. And when he says there was always something to do, he ain't kidding. On top of touring and recording and learning how to dance, he was also sending someone ahead of them on each tour stop to locate a Kingdom Hall so that he would not miss a single meeting. At the time, Jehovah's Witnesses held 3 meetings a week. They also have a sort of quota for the amount of time that they're expected to go out door to door and placing literature, which he donned disguises to do and did so every week. Most ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have that same feeling of their time being robbed while they were in the religion, but most of us were window washers and plumbers. Imagine trying to juggle all of that with a high-profile tour schedule. On top of that, he was forbidden from the most common social event of our society, holidays. No birthday parties, no Christmas, not even exchanging innocent Valentine cards with friends. Michael Jackson's sexuality is definitely the least understood thing about him and the most difficult to analyze. Despite the crotch grabs and the rock with you lyrics, he seemed largely unsexual. I mean, a lot of people have a hard time believing he actually fathered his children. As with everything else, he was stuck in a tug of war between his father's ideals, or lack thereof, and his mother's strict religion. Sexual repression is a huge thing amongst witnesses. I mean, not only are you not allowed to masturbate, and you can't have sex before marriage, you're made to feel guilty for even having sexual thoughts. And even when you get married and you can finally have sex, foreplay is still out and you can still only do missionary, you are told to bury your natural sexual urges and pretend as if they don't exist. And all while they're constantly telling you not to even think about sexual things, they can't stop talking about sexual stuff. They're obsessed with it. They talk about this kind of stuff on a stage in front of little kids, so you're exposed to it from the time you're born. And judging from the material that they found during the police raids of Neverland Ranch, it's safe to say that Michael Jackson was, at the least, bisexual. That opens up a whole different level of shame and guilt that his indoctrination laid upon him. Homosexuality is considered among the peak of sexual perversions. There's probably more people that have been punished for being gay than there have for people that have been punished for child sex abuse. And to be honest, there's a lot of other religions that try to force this kind of sexual repression on their members, and each of them face issues with child sex abuse. When your urges are repressed, they fester, and they're going to manifest one way or another. Nobody really knows the cause of pedophilia or where it comes from, but I would not be surprised one bit if religious sexual oppression contributes to it. My complete armchair theory is that it has less to do with an actual attraction to children as it does with exploring desires in a situation and with a person that they feel they can control. And that's my hot take. I'm probably wrong, not a psychologist. And here's a big one. He came from a background that considers pop stars, fame, and success as evil. Jehovah's Witnesses view ambition as selfish and haughty. Not only do they discourage higher education, but they look down on any sort of personal success at all. They describe people who focus on personal ambition rather than the preaching work as blood guilty. If you didn't do everything that you could to get to as many doors as you could, some of those bodies that are going to be left in Armageddon are your fault because you didn't get to them. And not only that, but they liken pop stars to the golden calf, a modern form of idolatry that caters to corrupt fleshly desires. You can see how this affected Michael Jackson in the bashful way that he conducted himself in interviews. He was not comfortable with the amount of attention he received, and he likely felt a lot of guilt for it. I mean, imagine what it must have been like to grow up in a high-control group that says fame is evil and pop stars are as good as the golden calf, all while you are becoming one of the most successful and famous people that have ever lived. A person that a lot of people now describe as a god. Throughout his rise to fame and even through his career's peak, Michael Jackson endured a lot of scrutiny from this religion. In 1983, Michael Jackson was publicly reproved for this. Yes, that was sufficient for public humiliation. What public reproof means is that at some point, the elders deemed this as something bad enough that he could have been kicked out of the religion and shunned for. That he was not removed and instead reproved means that he apologized for what he did, he acknowledged that he'd done something wrong and promised to fix it. This would lead to an announcement of his reproof, which is reportedly what happened, and he faced restrictions in the congregation as a consequence. For this. 1983 was actually a really defining year for him in more ways than one. Directly after Billie Jean, he released the Thriller video. Anyone who's been a witness knows how controversial this was. It was such a big deal and there was so much gossip about it that it's still a common misconception that he was disfellowshipped or disassociated over this video. The disclaimer at the beginning of the video that he does not endorse a belief in the occult was intended to keep the witnesses off his back. Despite this, Watchtower still extracted an apology out of him for an issue of their Awake magazine. He said, "I would never do it again. I just intended to do a good, fun short film, not to purposely bring to the screen something to scare people or to do anything bad. I want to do what's right. I would never do anything like that again. Because a lot of people were offended by it. That makes me feel bad. I don't want them to feel that way. I realize now that it wasn't a good idea. I'll never do a video like that again. In fact, I have blocked further distribution of the film over which I have control, including its release in some other countries. There's all kinds of promotional stuff being proposed on Thriller, but I tell them, no, I don't want to do anything on Thriller, no more Thriller." It was during this year that he started to really break records and was probably the most remembered time of his career. Witnesses took note, recalled their disdain for fame, and in 1984, elders issued an ultimatum for him that he must choose between his music career and Jehovah's Witnesses. He responded, "I'm still living according to the Watchtower Society's teachings. I still go door to door wherever I am, even if I'm on tour. I can't help it if people hang up my poster on their wall or tear my picture out of a magazine. I don't ask them to idolize me. I only want them to enjoy my music." He continued under their scrutiny for a few more years after this until the elders asked him to shun his sister LaToya. She writes in her memoir that she found him crying in Janet's bedroom, where he said, "LaToya, I can't ever talk to you again. The elders had a big meeting and they told me to never speak to you because you haven't been coming to the Kingdom Hall. They said that if I don't stop talking to you, they'll kick me out of the religion." She then says Michael decided to disobey the elders' edict and after that never attended any more meetings. He subsequently severed his ties to the organization through a formal letter. What made this painful episode even more agonizing was that, for a long time, I believe Michael might be one of the remnant, the select 144,000. He disassociated in 1987. It's worth noting that it was later in this very same year that he began to pursue a relationship with James Safechuck, one of the two boys from Leaving Neverland. In 1988, he purchased Neverland Ranch, and his downfall into depression and strange behavior began in earnest. If you mention this to a current Jehovah's Witness, they will come up with a canned response that it's because he left Jehovah. Watch the comments, I guarantee somebody will say it. That is more gaslighting behavior from the supposedly harmless religion. He spiraled because he deconverted from a cult, and as far as I know, never sought professional help in doing so. In the book Leaving the Cult, some of the after effects described of people leaving a Bible-based cult that could be applied to Michael Jackson include depression and a sense of alienation, loneliness, low self-esteem and low self-confidence, phobic-like constriction of social contacts, distrust of professional services, problems in reactivating a value system to live by. Because he never properly deconverted, his witness background followed him for years afterward. He continued to not celebrate birthdays, as was shown in the documentary. He celebrated his first Christmas with Elizabeth Taylor, who showed up unannounced at his house to surprise him with his first Christmas, which by the way he did not consent to. And after it was over, he expressed discomfort, saying that he felt like he was doing something wrong.
Same time, it's exciting. I felt guilty too at the same time. I remember going in the bathroom crying later because I felt I had done something wrong because I was raised not to ever celebrate it.
It also comes out in his views of education, which were expressed in Leaving Neverland, when he told Wade Robson that he didn't need an education, nothing good ever came out of it, why bother? A lot of witnesses think that way, and a lot of them continue to think that even after they leave. I mean, for heaven's sake, he built his own paradise, and Neverland Ranch, complete with every exotic animal you ever saw in a JW pamphlet. He even featured imagery, largely reminiscent of Armageddon and its transition into paradise, in his music video Earth Song. And the description of grooming that James Safechuck and Wade Robson underwent largely reflects how Jehovah's Witnesses get people to convert into their cult. They begin by being approachable, kind, trustworthy. You trust them before they even talk to you. They start with a scripture from your Bible. They're just here to talk about the Bible. It could be any Bible, really. And then when you're comfortable, they shift you over to their Bible. And then suddenly, you're not reading the Bible at all anymore, you're reading their propaganda. Then they take you to their version of Neverland Ranch, which they call a kingdom hall, and they love bomb you. They convince you that this is the most loved you've ever felt. They tell you to be proud of being groomed. Yeah, you're being groomed, you should be proud of that. You should be proud of being a sheep. They literally say this. And before you realize what's happened, you're baptized. And the person that brought you in is gone. They don't need you anymore, they've moved on to somebody else. But you're here now, and suddenly, the idea of letting your child die due to a blood transfusion doesn't seem that crazy anymore. And no one on the outside notices that anything dangerous is happening because they're such nice people, aren't they? They couldn't really do that, could they? If Michael Jackson knew how to brainwash and groom victims, it's because he learned from the best. He probably wouldn't even know that he was doing it. Further, the alleged victim's experience of coming to terms with what has happened to them reflects that of those exiting a cult. It sometimes takes years for people to realize the full extent of something that's happened to them, whether it's abuse as a child or exiting a cult. Many of them live in denial of it for decades, and they fear speaking out about it because they don't think anybody will believe them. They have misgivings about doing it because they're not convinced that it was really that bad. They'd been groomed to believe that they were complicit and gaslit into believing that their experience was normal. Everyone else grows up this way too. This is love. Anything negative to be found in it was their own doing. Now, when it comes to Michael Jackson, I want to reiterate that we will never know the full truth of these allegations. But we do know that he was the victim of his own fame and that he was the product of a high-control Doomsday cult. This is a cult that was found to have 1,006 allegations of child sex abuse in Australia alone, none of which had been reported to the police. If you want to know more about the religion behind the icon, visit jwfacts.com, who I must also thank for gathering a lot of the information I used here into one place. And if you're a Jehovah's Witness that will no longer listen to Michael Jackson because you heard about an abuse cover-up, I implore you to look into the thousands of identical cases being covered up by your own religion. As for the rest of us, let's do everything that we can to make sure that a string of tragedies like this never happens again.
What ability have we got to protect every child in Australia?
Well, what you can do is you can report to the child protection authorities.
And that is done in some cases.
But generally it's not done, is it?
No.
It's not done unless there's a legal requirement for it to be done, is there?
That is true.